on another very important topic, actually, because we were talking about the maturity of digital health, or the growing maturity of digital health. One important sector is the question of mobile health app, or mobile health in general. And we have the pleasure to receive today Fiona Costello. Fiona is Vice President of National Accreditation at Orca. Orca is a company developing... Hi, Fiona. I was expecting you here. I'm lost. Please take the clicker. So Fiona has a long experience in both with public and private sector. You worked with the NHS. You worked as well for private companies in the domain of technology and health and digital health in general. And you will talk about this national accreditation program, which are developing more and more with different criteria, different frameworks sometimes. And your company has an expertise, a clear expertise and a leading expertise in this domain and this area, and you will explain us the work you're doing on this. Fiona.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction, Julianne. And thank you very much for listening and being here for my presentation. I'd like to start with just introducing a bit of background to Orca. So Orca stands for the Organization for the Review of Care and Health Apps. And we were set up because we understood the potential for digital health technologies in really transforming patient pathways. We've heard a lot this morning about the different challenges facing healthcare, the very real challenges facing healthcare: workforce, demand management, capacity planning, an aging population, a need to change from being a very reactive healthcare service to a very proactive healthcare service that targets prevention and early intervention. And so it's within that context that we've been giving a lot of thoughts about how do we harness the potential of digital health products in a way that healthcare professionals will feel that they can trust it and that they'll use it in their pathways. So with that in mind, I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about how we support the digital patient and how we've been prioritizing the development of an infrastructure to enable that to happen. So I'm sure that you're all aware, if you've all got a smartphone, you'll know that there's a huge amount of apps on Google Play and the App Store. There are actually 365,000 digital health products on live, and also there's more than 287,000 that have been updated in the last 18 months. How do we know which are safe, effective, and suited to your clients or to your patients? We know that 93% of healthcare professionals recognize the benefits of digital health technologies. We know that 87% of patients welcome digital health technologies as part of their treatment. But as I say, how do we know which are safe, effective, and suitable? How do we know that we're not, as clinicians, as healthcare professionals, exposing ourselves to risk? How do we distinguish between apps that are evidence-based and those that are evidence-informed? So with that in mind, it's important that we try and understand what the barriers are to using digital health apps in healthcare settings. The first one is an awareness. Apps are not yet part of the day-to-day management of health and care-related conditions. That's certainly the case in the UK. It's important that we understand that healthcare professionals do not actually get routine education and training in the use of digital health products as part of what has remained a fairly traditional healthcare curriculum. Accessibility, I'm sure that you will understand the challenges. In the UK, it's estimated that for a general practitioner in primary care, they probably have between 8 to 10 minutes with each patient that they see. They don't have time to navigate Google Play or the App Store to understand which app would be suited to their patient. The trust. This is probably the most important one. The lack of a suitable quality indicator inhibits the embracing of apps, and by that we mean web-enabled and mobile health technologies by end users and professionals in health and care space. And governance. How do we create an infrastructure that supports this implementation? The lack of clarity around the regulatory landscape and the appropriate governance foundations delivers organizational uncertainty. That's where Orca comes in. Our founder, chief exec, Liz Ashaw-Payne, she was a speech and language therapist by background, and she was made acutely aware as technology became more and more a part of her day-to-day life as a speech and language therapist. She became more aware of her own personal capacity and how digital and technology could increase her reach. Rather than meeting one patient's needs, she can meet millions of patients' needs, and that's what drives us all here today at this great event. We at Orca use the analogy of medicine and medication. In all other areas of health and care, we have the critical infrastructure in place for safe decision-making and distribution. But why is it that we think digital health is different? Why is it that when we talk about digital therapeutics, when we talk about prescribing digital health, we don't have a similar infrastructure in place? If you take the medication example, in the UK, we have the MHRA, the Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, to approve and license drugs. We have NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Effectiveness, to assess impact and effectiveness. We've got the British National Formulary, which collates those products that have been through that process to know when and how to prescribe. Doctors have a book that they can consult and use to inform how they approach medication. Indeed, that extends to being able to think about how a solution, how a medication might meet the very different needs of one patient to another. We don't prescribe the same medication for every single patient, and it absolutely should be the same for digital health products. And finally, we have E-Prescribing to distribute and track medicines. So we know what we're prescribing, we know how we're prescribing, we know what's more popular, what's not more popular. And underpinning all of this, as I've mentioned, is training. We provide clinicians with the access and the tools to make effective prescribing decisions, and yet the same does not extend to digital health. As I said, it all starts with trust. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about digital health assessment frameworks. There are multiple frameworks to help the NHS in the UK and local authorities to assess a digital health solution, and we're seeing increasingly that that's the case across the world. They include universal regulations and specific measures developed purely for digital health, and indeed over the last couple of years we've seen this in the context of medical devices. There are lots of common requirements for data and privacy, usability and accessibility. There's less consensus and convergence in areas, clinical assurance and evidence evaluation, and security assessment. I know from my own experience in working for a digital mental health product that the perception of the effectiveness of mental health, digital in mental health, varied hugely from clinician to clinician in terms of their own understanding of barriers, particularly in relation to the therapeutic alliance. We also need to think about security assessment. Obviously, whilst the foundations of data privacy and the foundations of data security don't change from country to country, there are different regulations. User experience in clinical analysis is largely unassessed. So here are just some examples of the multiple frameworks. We've got the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence. They created the Evidence Standards Framework, which tiered digital health products depending on what they did and at what point of the pathway. So as an example, for level 1 and level 2, you'll see products that are at the well-being end of the spectrum. At level 3 and 4, you'll see products that are much more designed to be active aids within a pathway as interventions in their own rights. In the NHS, we've got the Digital Technology Assessment Criteria. That's a self-assessment. It's prone to ambiguity in terms of how it's interpreted. In the EU, we have the emerging ISO 82304-2 standard. We've got DIGA in Germany. Obviously, this is really important for startups and founders out there in terms of how do you approach healthcare systems, how do you get your products reimbursed. In mental health in Belgium, the mobile health Belgium validation period. And then the Nordics, we've been working with the Nordics to create a Nordic baseline review. And this is an important point. The Nordics are an interesting example because from a startup perspective, that is talking about the challenges that it happens when you're looking at small populations and the benefits of states coming together to create a standardized framework, which again, for startups is much easier. Rather than approaching a population of 3 million, you have the benefits of creating an evidence standard for a population that then targets 27 million across the 5 Nordic states. This makes a difference for you as startups when you're thinking about how to focus your business development activities, when you're thinking about how to future-proof your product moving into Europe in particular. The Orca baseline review process, which is what Orca does, is taking a revolutionary approach to technology assessment. So what we do is we have a site of all of these products, and we take them through what we call the review engine. It's now approaching its 7th iteration, and it's about taking the commonality of Orca baseline standards, which draws on evidence, best practice, and guidelines from around the world to create a baseline criteria, as the name would suggest. We then build on that in terms of enhanced assessment, which gets into the more fundamental requirements to enter a new market. It's 350-point evaluation plus. This is basically, we take overarching principles that govern the use of healthcare. So take, for example, data privacy, security, professional assurance, usability, and accessibility, and we apply a subset of micro questions, which is why it's 350 point. And it takes the ambiguity out to make a very objective analysis of digital health products. And it assesses the app's compliance, and it allocates it a score, so it gives an indication to healthcare systems and hospitals as to the products that have reached that benchmark of quality assurance. We also understand that this is a very dynamic market. Digital health changes at a rapid pace. Our technology has been designed with that in mind, so we know when an app has been developed, when it's been changed, when it's been reviewed. We actively engage with our developer community to understand how their product roadmap can influence the development of their assessment and their strategies for complying with that assessment standard. So these are some of the examples of the international schemes that we assess against. As I said, the NHS DTAC, the EU ISO, the US Digital Health Assessment that we've been working on. In Canada, the Mental Health Commission to create a mental health app assessment standard. The German, the DIGA, we can talk about incremental progress. As we run through some of these standards, we often see that baseline remains the same. It's then about making it tailored to the different markets. Netherlands, we've been doing some similar work with mental health, and the 5 Nordic nations, and in New Zealand with Health Navigator. And it's at this point that I'd like to sort of talk to you a little bit about how the development of these standards, in the same way that a digital health product isn't stagnant and doesn't change, nor does our assessment. We've seen customers and government and policymakers actively engage with us about the development of these international schemes, our assessment schemes, and make them much more relevant to their populations. So, for example, in Canada and New Zealand, they have spent a lot of time and effort in trying to understand how they can assess digital health products to meet the needs of their indigenous populations, taking into account usability and accessibility. Indeed, in Canada, we've had people with lived experience actively contribute to this mental health app assessment framework. We are also seeing healthcare systems and healthcare hospital providers, more and more they're starting to talk to us about interoperability. This is taking into account that next level of the embedding of digital health products in pathways. So for example, hyper-personalization. If I as a patient go and see my GP, I have a condition, that generates my healthcare record, and as a result of that, I have an immediate set of recommendations made to me on what digital health products would be right for me, taking into account my demographics, taking into account my condition, and maybe even additional associated conditions. That also can embrace the biopsychosocial approach. So if, for example, you have a long-term condition, in addition to receiving a targeted app focused on that long-term condition, you may also receive a recommendation on a mental health app to support you manage that. As I said, the digital health mistake is to not frame and align your digital health products with clinical and operational priorities. It's so important that we create the right infrastructure to talk about these different areas, to make sure that our apps are future-proofed and relevant to the populations in which we're serving, but also relevant to the people that we want to prescribe them in a way that works for digital health. App assessment frameworks are not the be-all and end-all. We do not want to create a stagnant app assessment framework that sits in a Word document somewhere. What do we do then with those technologies? How do we then make them accessible to patient populations? The next stage of what Orca does is our digital health libraries and formularies. We curate those apps, and we take all of the information that we've amassed through taking our apps through the assessment framework, and we create these digital health libraries and these digital health formularies that can then be used for healthcare professionals to recommend digital health products to their patients. and for patients to access them as part of early intervention and prevention strategies. More and more, we're seeing the curation of very formulated libraries, and that extends to the curation of toolkits. So, for example, in the UK, for those of you familiar with the UK, you'll know that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have now got a huge backlog of waiting list patients. I think in December it was 6 million people. And therefore, it's about how do we support our healthcare systems to create pathways with digital at the heart of it. Indeed, I was talking to NHS England a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that digital health is at the heart of their recovery plans. And that's taking into account where a digital health product can be used across the pathway, whether it's surgery optimization, so it's thinking about how does a patient supported to tackle the lifestyle factors that influence whether the surgery is going to be successful or not. So thinking about smoking cessation, being healthy, being active. Similarly, how do we think about treatment compliance that can support recovery? In MSK, that might be a physiotherapy app. We also have the Digital Health Academy. We've heard today about how the EU strategies in terms of EU health, they're looking at workforce, they're looking at workforce readiness. Orca is already doing this. We've launched, in partnership with Boehringer, a Digital Health Academy that's focused on having a foundational level layer assessment that introduces healthcare professionals to the concepts underpinning the use of digital within clinical pathways. We are then creating incremental modules that build on that information and start to tackle very real problems and issues that healthcare professionals address that may well limit how they use digital health technology on a day-to-day basis. So as I said, when we think about digital health, when we think about the infrastructure that we want to put in place to support the optimization of digital health and make sure that we're maximizing its full potential, there's 4 key points: trust, awareness, accessibility, and governance. And I would encourage this community, this great community, which consists of so many people that are so committed to digital health, to truly support this digital health revolution. We have to build trust in digital health. We have to make sure that we're aligning digital health to clinical and operational priorities to make sure that we're not losing healthcare professionals who are absolutely the enablers of this. We know that if a healthcare professional makes a recommendation to a patient, they're 70% more likely to actively act on it, as opposed to an individual just going on Google Play or iTunes. There's so many examples of how we know people can download apps, never to look at it ever again. We can talk about overcoming awareness and access barriers to deliver activated healthcare professionals and patients. We talk a lot in healthcare about how do we get people to take ownership of their health? How do we move away from a paternalistic model of healthcare to one where patients are empowered and they take a keen interest? This is it. Digital has the potential to do this. Every single person in this room likely has a smartphone. There are more smartphones on the planet than there are toilets and toothbrushes. That is a staggering statistic. And we need to have a clear governance and risk management system in place to ensure that digital health is used in the correct way, the appropriate way, and in a way that maximizes the engagement of healthcare professionals. And with 2 minutes left, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Fiona. Please join me here. We have a few minutes for questions about this accreditation scheme that you present us and the support from and the services from Orca on this topic. It's probably one of the sub-markets in digital health that evolved more in the last year, the mobile health models of accreditation or certification. We have seen, and you presented, the different countries having different strategies and approach. Can we imagine in the future convergence of this model, of these countries? We've seen recently, for instance, the President Macron in France saying that he was admiring the German model of DIGA and wanting to copy-paste with some adaptation in France. Can it change something in terms of convergence of the European countries, for instance?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that whilst it looks like it's very disparate and uncoordinated from country to country, actually what we'll find and what has been enabled through the Orca baseline review is a the commonality. It recognizes the commonality. But I think the biggest challenge actually is less the differences between the different standards, but the scale and pace at which they're implemented. So for example, with the German DiGA at the moment, it's targeting a relatively small proportion of digital health products, more at the medical device end. That still leaves a huge proportion of digital health products that aren't being assessed via frameworks. So it's about learning the lessons from different countries, taking into account best practice, and creating this convergence. But it's within our gift, I think.
Yep. Good. Another question. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have some questions. Yeah, we can bring it. Just one question before you ask yours, Fiona. One question. The companies you work with, usually they come to you at the beginning of the process of development of their app, or when they are confronted to the market and to the specification or the demand from a client to be aligned with an accreditation program.
So it's interesting. I think that, do you mean as in digital health products themselves, startups?
I mean the companies developing this kind of digital health products, do they think about this accreditation criteria at the beginning or when they are
No, I don't think so. I think that that most founders are motivated by a problem that they're trying to solve, and that they get very inspired, and then it becomes about funding, and that actually, I'm speaking at another event tomorrow, which is about how do we front end and how do we educate our startups to be prepared for this journey. Very often, in my experience of working with developers, you'll have products that their roadmap suggests that they'll change. They'll go from one area to another. So, for example, a wellness tool will suddenly become a device, and then they're suddenly exposed to a world of regulations that up until that point they'd had no idea about. We're trying to very much change that. We're trying to create a kind of a very standardized approach that creates a sort of an education around this, using tools like the Digital Health Academy to enable developers to kind of think about this right from the outset, to think about what is my product trying to solve? How do I envisage the development of my product in the future, taking into account things like investment, and what does that mean in terms of these regulatory standards? So we're very much trying to demystify that.
Yeah.
And we're also trying to recognize the challenges moving from one territory to another. So, particularly in Europe, and it's pertinent given that we're in Barcelona, when you think about the EU, that's 27 different countries, 27 different languages, different populations. That's where we've been trying to work. With the Nordic Baseline Review as an example of trying to get that convergence to change what a population of 3 million to make it more attractive by having a commonality of standards that then covers that population of 27 million.
Yeah.
And we have information resources. One of my favorite bits of my job is actually talking to developers, so listening to their inspiration, their passion for their product, but talking to them and about kind of providing a bit of education about how we can future-proof their solution.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we've been longer. Please, your question.
Yes, as Amazon and Google and Amazon, Google, and all the major players that are the gateway for you to get published as an application. They're now in the healthcare space too. They're all getting their feet wet in that. And they're developing great applications for the healthcare. Those there are going to be implemented by those organizations that's a prerequisite or a standard, so you can publish your application in the healthcare industry? Is that going to be something that they are going to be asking that you meet the requirements of these standards that you need to do to publish your application?
I think it's fair to say they're not quite there yet. I think that certainly there is still very much a role for governments and policymakers to play in deciding how, when, where these digital health products will be used in their healthcare settings and the standards by which they assess them against. What we do know, though, is that as when they get involved in the sort of the funding of these, I mean, I know that I was working with a physiotherapy product a few years ago, and they were part of the Google sort of innovation accelerator. We're absolutely committed to working with those big players to support that investment journey, to support that co-production journey in terms of future-proofing their solutions ready for what still sits with government health bodies fundamentally, particularly when you think about things like reimbursement in pathways. I hope that answers your question.
But do you think they have a kind of responsibility as well? Because we see sometimes emerging, you were talking about risk, about using digital products. We see emerging some apps or some digital health product in this platform, which could be damaging for some people if they take the information of these products like this. Do they have a responsibility, or do they think, and do you think they have a responsibility? Which certainly a different answer.
Am I answering as myself, or am I answering as Orca? I personally think that they do have a responsibility. I think that any organization that has the impact and the ability to touch millions of people's lives have a responsibility in the information they disseminate. I think that that's where certainly we would be inspired to have conversations with the likes of Google, with the likes of Apple, to talk to them about how can we at that point of gatekeeping, create some kind of checklist process for health and care apps, recognizing the danger and the risk. But I think there will always be a place for additional assessment layers and additional accreditation schemes that are relevant to those patient populations that they're trying to serve, and that are relevant to different countries' approaches, different populations, as I said, with Canada and New Zealand, their indigenous populations, in a way that the big companies may not necessarily think is their responsibility, in the way that it is the government's responsibility.
Yeah. Understood. Thanks. Another question here and another one here. The two last one.
Okay.
Please, your name
Okay.
and your organization.
Okay, yes, I'm Roberto Martin and I'm a private investor and mentor. My question is, what about regarding the regulation for physicians to prescribe these apps? Because you will have a lot amount of apps approved and perfectly working, but you know that physicians sometimes are a little bit afraid to prescribe an app because they don't know exactly what can happen. Even, for example, insurance, what will happen when they prescribe a drug? They have an insurance if the patient requires something. Okay, but for digital apps, and how are you working on this? How prescribers should work? This will be public prescriptions or no? You know, this, because a lot of apps will be approved. Okay, they're on the market. Let's push, and now pull. And physicians in the middle. Huh?
I think it's a really good question and a really good comment. I absolutely think this is an incremental journey. I think that at the moment, we're very much focused on creating that right infrastructure in the first place, to curate those apps, to assess the apps against a quality standard, to understand what's available. And I think that as we do that, as healthcare systems in particular start to build their own assessment layers and they involve clinicians in the creation of those assessment standards, we're then creating that trust and assurance in terms of how they're used. But absolutely, this is a journey. This isn't going to happen tomorrow. Because I know from my own experience of working with digital health, you know, it was funny actually, I was going to finish with an anecdotal story, but I remember when I was working for digital mental health products and we wanted to be used in an IAP service, and pretty much 2 years to the day, I was having this argument with this clinical lead who was saying to me, it undermines the therapeutic alliance. How do I know it works? How do I know that this is what you're saying it is? And this again is the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed, and where the likes of DIGA is trying to create that trust and assurance by taking it through that process, you know, to really quite onerous requirements from a startup perspective, randomized control trials, a €10,000 application fee. But obviously all of these elements combined is creating the right system in which healthcare professionals can start to trust the ability for digital health products to be prescribed. But are we there today? No, I think we're not. But I think we're on an incremental journey towards that.
Thank you. A last question from you.
Hi, my name is Olman Elizondo from Valle Verón Innovation Unit. We're part of a consortium in a European team called PP that it's a platform for innovation in procurement and procurement of innovation. And from this perspective, we take that the journey towards adopting innovation comes from the need of a professional in the healthcare setting, but it could also be from citizens or from patients. And in this circumstance, the game is a little different than the startup or the spin-off game. And the idea here is that we're also trying to get this involvement from the demand side in participating by making cross-border needs from different systems already that will serve the validation to happen from a work that's done previously. So that clinician you were talking about, maybe he has those needs in his mind, but there are so many apps to choose from that none of them actually fit their own need. So it's kind of a previous work, and it's kind of a different path towards adoption of innovation. And I was wondering that this methodology of assessment could also be introduced in this community. So at the end, it's a community practice that we want to enable not just the demand-driven side, but also the industry-driven, because those are the ones that will be rewarded at the end with those public funds. But we want to get sort of like a fitted suit for our need. Have you given any thoughts? We're actually on the consortium. There's King's College, London, and Karolinska. There's 7 university big hospitals and Aquas as a health assessment technology, but also procurement of innovation assessment. And I was wondering if you had any contact with that, or if that would be something that would suit or be interesting to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the power of the visibility of digital health products absolutely has the ability to then harness that potential, but in understanding where the gaps are and understanding where different healthcare products can come in. When I talked about the Canadian mental health app assessment framework and how it's now taking into account the user experience, taking into account how it actively engages with people that otherwise might not be represented or might not be considered in the development of the app. And we're hoping that in a Digital Health Accreditation Assembly scheduled for later this year, I'm going to invite the Commission back because I really want to talk to them about what that finding is, to then generate improvements in the digital health space overall, and to be able to start to feed some of this back to the market to then stimulate innovation. I think first and foremost, though, it has to come from visibility. It has to come from really understanding and really benchmarking what digital health products are out there today to then understand where those gaps are. And we do a lot of work with, certainly in the UK, with academic health science networks, with innovation funds, innovation accelerators, to talk to them about digital health products. And increasingly that visibility of those products will will take us into a space where we're able to more proactively support the market in that respect. If you want to talk to me, by all means, come and find me.
Great. Another networking opportunity. Good.
Is that it?
Thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to join us today. We can applaud her.